I am Dr. Maya Bristow Klein. I do go by Maya. I'm a psychologist and psychoanalyst in private practice located in Southern California. I'm also the founder of Pathformers, which is a platform for parents and professionals who are looking for some support in navigating childhood mental health and development. My topic that I'll be talking about today is actually adapted from pathformers.com. We're just going to talk about some features of it, but if you're interested in the full course or presentation, it's called From Self to Selfie: How Devices and Media Impact Emotional Growth in Kids and Teens. So that's what I'll be talking with everyone about today.
Perfect. So I guess the $1 million, no, actually with inflation, the $1 billion question is, how does devices impact our children?
Tremendously. The impact actually starts at infancy, and the research on this is really compelling. We're finding that parents who are engaging with devices while they're also engaging with their children, this interesting thing occurs where children, infants especially, begin to associate devices with emotional comfort. And if parents are over relying on devices or social media, then that can become part of the caregiving milieu. And you can imagine over time, if that stage is being set as an infant's brain is developing, the wiring that occurs to remain connected to devices instead of engaging in real human to human interaction. So we're seeing effects start very early and then progress into teenage years, and in some cases cause a rather regressive functioning in a child's development.
So when you say regressive development, how can parents identify that to, if they can't catch it before it happens, catch it early enough where that maybe they can make some correction?
Well, that's such a great question. And it's important to have a sense of what we psychologists refer to as developmental milestones. So these are things that generally children should be achieving as they move from one developmental stage to the next. I'll give you a few examples. So in toddlerhood, there's this phase called the rapprochement phase. And what is ideally occurring is that a toddler is going out into the world, they're discovering their independence, they're running around, they're bumping into things. And hopefully they return back to their parents for emotional safety and comfort when they run into something scary or new. We want that to actually occur because what that back and forth process does is it co-regulates the child. It begins to help them internalize a sense of what safety feels like and turn to their parents or other humans, adults in their lives, to develop a sense of emotional regulation. So, in that stage, if you're starting to see a child sort of spend too much time away from you, or on the other end of that spectrum, cling a little bit too much and not be willing to go out and explore the world, then that might give you some indication that something's amiss. And what we're seeing also in the vein of devices and social media usage is that a lot of young children are being given devices when they feel upset, when they stumble into something in the world that's disorganizing. And that kind of sets things off because they don't develop that emotional muscle of how can I regulate myself internally and with the external world around me, not with this device. So it's helpful to know about those kinds of milestones that will indicate to us if something is not developing appropriately in our children.
Has the handheld devices become the 2025 version of the pacifier?
Wow, what a good, yeah, that's such a spot on observation, particularly in the function that a pacifier serves, which is to self-soothe. And adults and children are both guilty. We're all guilty of this. Sometimes I'll work with teenagers, and actually, in our sessions, if we're talking about something that's anxiety provoking, they'll look down at their phone and they'll start scrolling in the session with their psychologist. And I often pull them out of that and I wonder, what just happened? Was it something we were talking about that was distressing for you, that you sought out your device for comfort or soothing or to be pacified? And that process, it's actually interesting because we can use the device as a signal to something's making a person anxious. So it doesn't have to be viewed as this negative thing. If we're using it appropriately, it can be a tool of communication. It's just that it has to be communicated and not just relied on for this prolonged pacifier function that you just so aptly brought up.
Because that's the first thing that came to mind when you described it. And then it also brought me back to, let's say, the love languages, right? Like for me, my parents, anytime they did something I didn't like, shut up, Terraine, here's a gift, here's a toy. So that was
Yeah.
the pacifier, right? So I grew up to dislike gifts because it made me uncomfortable and it reminded me of when they would just say, okay, you know what? We're sorry, here it goes. And then when you brought up the example of the devices, how you would sit the child in front of it, it was like children in the playpen. Oh, you're crying? Here's a pacifier. And it would calm them down, right? But from what I've read, from a psychological perspective, you're supposed to go from being soothed by others to soothing yourself, right? Are children struggling with that since they're always surrounded by devices that soothing themselves instead of them doing it internally?
They are. And I think as a result, we are seeing increases in childhood anxiety and depression. And we're also seeing that these symptoms of anxiety and depression are manifesting much earlier in children than in past times. I think something that is occurring or missing is that when a child, hurts himself or herself, or they're in school and a friend says something that hurts their feelings. There's not, I don't want to say globally, but I think there's less of a likelihood that an adult is present and nearby to reflect back to the child, oh, I can see why that would hurt. Or to take that hurt and help the child elaborate it into that made you sad and that probably made you really angry, and how can you take those feelings and dwell with them a bit? And maybe as you dwell with them, you discover solutions to the friendship or to the injury that you just had. So that a process is unfolding between two people, and then a child takes that information and internalizes it. And that's what they use to begin to self soothe and begin to emotionally regulate themselves, even in the absence of their caregivers. Now, with devices, you know, I like to think of them as stably unstable. So a child or a teen can turn to a device and they might know, if I post this picture, then I'll get this like. But what they might not predict is a different kind of reaction. And so they know that they can go in and they can, engage in this action, but they're not always aware or able to predict the response from the environment. And that can be really unsettling for a child who's really trying to stabilize their emotional state. So while there's some stability in the stimuli, there's not so much stability or predictability in the response, which can be very flustering, especially for a 10, 11, 12-year-old who are just beginning to develop a sense of themselves.
So if Maya, the mother, doesn't tell me I love me today, I will log on and Terrain, the follower, would tell me I love me today.
That's, I think, the wish. Yes, yes, but it's not always the reality. And this creates this really vicious cycle of, as your other speaker was just talking about, perfecting one's self. to acquire the sense of I am loved and I am lovable. So I can airbrush this, or I can say this one thing or do this other thing, and that'll get me more likes. And unfortunately, that can reinforce this drive and strive toward perfection that is unrealistic and impossible to achieve.
And then you have the impacts on the men and the women. The men, I'm generalizing here, will try to make their bodies as physically strong as possible. Bigger, stronger, more likes. Women, more cleavage, more skin, more likes and attention. And it's all coming from what maybe they think they're lacking within the home or what they perceive that they're lacking in the home. Would that be accurate?
I think that would be accurate. And that also tracks with um, something we're starting to see in terms of diagnosis, and that is an earlier diagnosis of narcissism in children. And in adults, a bit more of what I call pernicious narcissism, where it becomes impossible for people to receive feedback that might help them become better people and grow. Criticism or critical thinking can begin to be internalized as sources of shame. And then you start to see this kind of pernicious narcissism where people become much more focused on their aesthetic and how they look. And really, I think this is a good segue to talk a little bit more about regression, because when you start to see someone being self-focused and putting themselves in the center of everyone else's world, that regresses a person back to this earlier stage of primary narcissism, where children are supposed to be the center of their child's world, of their parents' world. Parents are supposed to be impressed by them and proud of them. And eventually, we hope that moves into secondary narcissism, where children develop reciprocal relationships and they're focused more on others and not so focused on themselves. But if we stay in this space of being self centered and adopting what I call a selfie culture, then people are more apt to stay in this primary narcissistic phase that's built upon not who I am in the world, but how do people look at me?
Beautiful. And someone asked the question, Maya, do you believe the advent of AI will increase the pacifier phenomena that we've been talking about?
I think in terms of handicapping our ability to be creative, innovative, and take risks. AI has this comforting, I think, in some ways, feature of curating our language. And as a result, creating a sense of ourselves that is not fully authentic or developed in a way that promotes real relating. And so that's a great question that an audience member asked, because I do think so. I do think that AI runs the risk of promoting a sense of self that is not real but is false. And what we know about the distance between a person's false self and their real self is that in between, the wider that gap is, the more likely they are to experience anxiety and depression, because they're having to split off a part of themselves that they deem unredeemable and only show the part of themselves that feels perfect and curated. And when that other part starts to rear its ugly head as it should, that can create anxiety like, oh no, what am I showing about myself? And how will this be received by others if it's not perfect?
If the parents are the safeguards to all of that, then where they are lacking, and this goes to another comment someone shared, who is policing the police? Meaning that if the parents are parenting the children, then where are the instructors, the supporters for the parents in those situations?
That is exactly why I created Pathformers. And I think it's why you're having this vital summit, is that parents need support. Parents are really finding themselves having to reinvent the wheel of what it means to be a parent and how to parent children in this very complicated time and season of life. And so I think the support comes from summits like this, platforms like Pathformers, and it comes from community. I think that community has taken a back seat, especially post-COVID, where we were operating in these very small pods and we were separate from one another. And I think even though that's 5 years ago, we're just now coming out into the social world and remembering each other. And so I think that parents have to remember that there are resources out there like this, and that there's a community that they can engage with face to face and show that to their children. Show their children what they might have missed out on from years of quarantine, or what they're continuing to not have access to when their nose is stuck in a phone. That old trope of be the change you want to see in the world. Resources that support parents should also help them be that change for modeling sake, and just so we can all develop flourishing lives.
Beautiful. And before I let you go, speak to us about the app. What kind of support does it give to parents as well as families in general?
Yeah, so I actually developed Pathformers because I noticed this gap where parents were calling me saying, I need help for my child. My child's therapist or the other providers that I reached out to have these long wait lists, and I just don't know where to turn to. So I developed Pathformers as a platform for parents to receive support. We cover a wide range of mental health and child development resources, starting from the foundations of development, where we have courses that are on things like colic and how to help your child if they're potty training, all the way to you have teenagers who are going to college, and how do you get them ready for that, especially if they're struggling with things like ADHD or anxiety. We also talk a lot about neurodivergence, autism, and other learning differences that can emerge over the course of a child's development. And we're really geared toward providing parents with the support so that they can better support their child. The point of Pathformers is to empower parents to help get their child back on a path towards success and resilience. So, how that works is parents, providers, family members can enroll in one or many of our courses, and they can go through the courses. Each module has about 15 different classes that parents can really invest in and digest information about different conditions, about different concerns. And alongside that, we're right there with them, providing worksheets and other resources they can use to reinforce their learning. And right now we're offering a discount to members or participants in the summit. Anyone can go to pathformers.com and receive 20% off. And I'll work with Terraine to get that link available to you. But I couldn't recommend it more. It's my passion project, and it's how I'm giving back years of clinical experience and working with parents and children to empower parents to help their children grow.
Thank you so much for that. And I know there's a number of people asking if they could be a part of it and share the knowledge, and you answered it before they could even ask it. So well done,
Oh,
Maya.
good.
Any last words before you leave today?
I do want to leave the participants with a few nuggets of to model to their child what their child might be losing, to focus on naming emotions with your child, and to realize you don't have to overhaul your life. You don't have to rob your child of their digital devices or punish them when they're engaged. too much with social media, but make the devices, because they're going to get access to them, especially if they're 11, 12, and older. Talk to your child about what they're seeing. Try to help them consider, is this fantasy or is this real life? And also engage them with the world around them, because there's so much beauty to be had in relationships. So I'll just leave with that.
Thank you so much, Maya. It is always a pleasure to speak to you, and thank you so much for joining me today at my summit.
Thank you. I'll see you again soon.